Truth Barista is a production of High Beam Ministry and uses the imaginary Ersatz coffee shop as its platform to bring you a conversation about a plethora of scintillating topics. We don't shy away from any issue that is plaguing our culture or the church today, whether it's current cultural issues, questions about Bible verses, or even just some banter to encourage you. Dr. Jay Christensen is the Truth Barista, and he and amazing Larry Kutzler brew up highly caffeinated conversations for our day. Grab a cup of joe, plop yourself down in the booth next to us, and get ready to think. The Truth Barista is a production of High Beam Ministry, and it's listener supported. For more information about the Truth Barista, go to highbeamministry.com. Thanks for listening.
Hello, this is Maurice. I am the host of the Ersatz Coffee Shop, and I greet you and seat you. I also will tell you the latest news and information about the Truth Barista. I also can take your orders. One steamy cup of God's truth coming up. Thanks for coming.
Dr. J, we're back into the anointed booth today, and last week we talked about baptism, and it was really, really good. So we want to encourage our audience to go back to last week's program and hear about the origins of baptism. Now today we're going to transition to the other ordinance that often we call ordinances in the church, and that is communion. And I'm looking so forward to this because there's a lot of connections to the communion service that we do and the Seder, but you'll unpack that today, right?
I will do my best here at the Ersatz Coffee Shop as we sit in the anointed booth to discuss these two important questions. And actually, you launched it last week by asking, hey, did Jesus invent baptism? Did Jesus invent communion?
I thought that very thing. I thought communion and baptism was basically done originally by Jesus, and we just, carried it forth. But, there's so much history to Christianity that comes out of the Old Testament or out of Judaism, and most of us, in quotations, Christians, aren't aware. That's why we're doing this program, Dr. J, because you're going to make them aware.
That's right. What's funny is over our ancient history in the early church, there was a streak of anti-Semitism there and a distancing this new move of Christianity and pulling it out of that messianic stream of Judaism and creating a Gentilized form. And so they said, well, communion replaces Passover. Our baptism of conversion replaces the Jewish baptisms going to the mikvah. Oh my gosh, that's so wrong, because when Jesus was doing it, those two things go directly back to Passover and the immersion services of Judaism of his day. So let's talk about this, okay? How do we know that communion came from the Passover Seder? Well, first of all, it says in the scriptures, in the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus said, I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you. A little while later, we see him sitting down to Passover. And then during the Passover, he says those words, this is my body, this is my blood, do this in remembrance of me. So it comes right out of the Passover Seder, or order of service, the celebration. So let me tell you where Passover came from, because those roots and themes push forward into communion. And actually what Jesus did. So here's the Passover. And if anybody's ever seen the Ten Commandments or Prince of Egypt or any of those kinds of biblical shows, you know that the Passover is where God saved his people Israel, who were held captive and enslaved in Egypt. So in a sense, they were enslaved and in bondage in a dark kingdom. So from the burning bush, God talks to Moses and sends him, Moses, as a deliverer of his people. And then by God's power and authority, Moses trashes. In fact, it's not really Moses who does it. He just kind of exercises the authority, and God backs him up by sending the awful plagues, the worst one being the death of the firstborn. And what you have to understand is if the firstborn of the family dies and there are no more kids or no more sons, that can destroy a family's heritage. And if you take out all the firstborn sons of Egypt, you're basically devastating the population of Egypt. And in fact, we have a document that was written about that time, a little afterwards, describing how utterly destroyed Egypt was and how it was annihilated for about 40 to 70 years until they started to recover. So it's really an amazing account. So Moses goes, Egypt is destroyed, and Moses, whose name means to draw out, Moses draws God's people out of Egypt. That's their salvation moment. And then, as you remember, they go running across the desert and they go through the Red Sea, which means they went across the Sinai Peninsula and they go through the Red Sea. And then on the western side of the Arabian Peninsula, and that's another discussion, he emerges with his people and they meet God at Mount Sinai, where he enters into a covenant. Israel enters into the Mosaic covenant with God. And in that commandment, so to speak, in those commands, is the commandment to celebrate Passover every year in the spring. We find this in Exodus 11, Exodus 12. We find it throughout the feasts of the Lord. And by the way, if anybody wants to learn about the feasts of the Lord, you really should go to highbeamministry.com and check out our online class. For $25, you get a 17-hour teaching on the feasts of the Lord in depth. So that'll teach you about Passover.
We want to thank our commercial sponsor for that brief moment of
You're a dork.
of selling a product. But that's a good thing to do, though.
No, I'm not selling a product. I want people to understand this. In fact, I'm glad you brought up this topic, because this was the topic that propelled me into ministry when I was in junior high, sitting in church. I'm watching the pastor celebrate communion, and I'm thinking to myself, well, where did this come from? So I started digging. And over the next 20 years, I eventually realized this is actually Passover. So my family started celebrating Passover, and this has become, if you want to say it, this is my main encouragement in ministry, is for people to get into the Jewish roots. Now, I've given you the ancient history. Let me tell you about the first century when Jesus is celebrating Passover, okay? The Passover in Jesus' days tells the story of the Exodus, and they used foods and songs to make it an unforgettable sensory experience. So they would eat unleavened bread, because when the Israelites came out of Egypt, they just grabbed the loaves of dough and they baked in the desert without rising. So unleavened bread, wine, bitter herbs, sweet sauces like jams and jellies were part of this meal. And so they would sit down and have this meal. And as they tell the story, they would eat the foods, and it would drive the point home. Once we were enslaved, now we are free. And this was very important to the Jews of Jesus' day, because they were under oppression again by the Romans. So they looked at Passover and said, will God deliver us again as he promised? Because he did say in scripture, I'm bringing forth a new king from David's line, and this is what the Jews were waiting for. So they would celebrate this storytelling. They would have a great meal. And then after supper, they would take a cup of wine to remember and commemorate the Passover lamb that substituted for the Hebrews' firstborn sons. Now, their wine is red wine, so it looks like blood. And so they would take a drink and say, I'm a part of this lamb's salvation. It is a part of me. And so they would drink of the cup of the lamb. And today in Passover celebrations, it has other names, the cup of salvation. I'll get into some of those maybe a little later. But for the sake of teaching, it's the cup of the lamb. Plus, they would take a piece of matzah early in the dinner, and they would break this unleavened bread, and they would put it aside for the end. So once they drank that cup of the lamb, they would eat the bread, which represented Moses, the deliverer who came, and looking forward to the deliverer that God promised. In fact, in Deuteronomy 18, 15 and 18, God says to the Israelites, they need leadership. So I'm going to bring a guy who's like you, Moses, and he's going to speak to them and lead them and guide them. And by the way, I'm going to hold them accountable if they ignore him. So this piece of unleavened bread, this matzah at the end of the meal, was a symbol of the deliverer who was to come, but a deliverer who has come, a deliverer like unto Moses. So in Jesus' day, it was just really a great meal. And it was really a fun time to get together with family and friends and recount the mercies, the love, and the grace of the Lord. Now, I'm going to throw it to you. What do you think about that? What's cooking around in your head, sir?
Well, what's cooking around my head, to me, Scripture is always connected. It's never disconnected, or it doesn't have gaps in it that do not make sense. So the Passover was a celebration of deliverance. The cross is a sign of deliverance. Both were delivering people, one from bondage of a physical sense and the other bondage from a spiritual sense. But they both are connected. And that's what I never saw as a young Christian, how connected they really were.
Right. Now let me make the connection for you, because you'll remember the Passover of Jesus' day, the main two items that were focused on was that cup of wine called the cup of the Lamb and that piece of unleavened bread known as the afikomen. And this was the blood of the Lamb and the symbol of the deliverer who is to come. So the scriptures say that after supper, Jesus took the cup of the Lamb and he holds it up in front of his disciples and he goes, guys, this is me. I'm the Lamb who will deliver you from the evil kingdom and make you God's people through another covenant, a new covenant. And by the way, that idea of a new covenant doesn't mean a brand new covenant. It's upgrading the old covenant. So it's covenant 2.0. And just as the old covenant was sealed with blood of animals, the new covenant will be sealed by better blood, Jesus' blood, which makes it lasting. And as there are terms in the old covenant, so those terms carry through to the new covenant. And so really it is covenant 2.0. Jesus holds up the cup and says, this is my blood sacrifice that seals you into the new covenant. I will be the forgiver of sin. I will be the remover of guilt. I will be the sacrifice that brings you peace and into fellowship with the Father. I will be the one who provides everything you need. And it is done through the blood, my sacrifice that I am going to pour out for you. And obviously I'm paraphrasing, Jesus goes on, and speaking of a sacrifice that frees you and delivers you from Satan's evil kingdom and into my Father's kingdom, he then takes the unleavened bread representing the deliverer who has come and will come. That's what afikomen means in the Greek, okay? And he says, this is me. I am your deliverer. I am the one through whom your Father will save you. And it won't come by the death of the enemy's firstborn son. This time, your deliverance will come by the death of God's firstborn son.
That's great, Doc. I have a question, though, because I'm picturing this in my mind as you're describing it. And Jesus is sitting down at this table with his disciples, and he's doing a Seder. That's what he's doing, and he's taking that afikomen in the early part of the Seder, and he's putting it in a napkin and kind of hiding it away. Is that what he takes then? I just want to be clear, and does what you just said he did with it.
In the modern Passover Seder, that's what's done. This piece of afikomen for the end of the meal is put into a napkin and put away, and then it's restored, which, by the way, in today's Passover Seder, that's a beautiful picture of Jesus dying, being wrapped in a shroud, being put into a tomb, and then resurrected to be that deliverer which the Father has promised. So even when you celebrate Passover today, oh my gosh, the pictures are so vivid, and the themes of deliverance and salvation and drawing near to God and becoming part of his covenant family are just all over the place. You want to teach your kids about what Jesus did for us? Man, learn to do a Messianic Jewish Passover. And then every time you celebrate communion, all of these themes and pictures and tastes and sights and sounds will come roaring back to you. So now the big question that we have to deal with is, where did communion come from related to the Passover? Now we have the two elements. We have the wine, which commemorates the blood of the Passover lamb. We have the afikomen, that leftover piece of unleavened bread that commemorates Moses. So Jesus takes this and he says, these two complete the picture of me. I'm the Passover lamb. I am the deliverer. It will be done by the shedding of my blood and the breaking of my body. Okay, so he's got that. And then he says this, whenever you do this, remember me. So what is he saying? He's saying to his disciples, whenever you celebrate Passover, add this in as the primary commemoration of the Passover, the ultimate revealing of what Passover is. Yes, celebrate Passover, but understand I am the fulfillment of it. You just think it's for Jewish people. This is for all people who will come to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They will be delivered. They will be saved. And so he says, whenever you do this, remember me. So Passover is an ancient plan Jesus' Father put in place about 1,500 years before Jesus to teach and prepare the Jews and Jesus' other followers from the Gentile world for what Jesus is about to do. And after that, it's the whole final 24 hours where he is indeed that sacrifice. His blood's poured out and his body is horribly broken on the cross. So, okay, now let me take you further. The Jewish community in that first century did observe Passover. Well, they also had what you call fellowship meals or love meals, agape meals. And this is where all of the believers, Jews and Gentiles, would get together. And they wanted to commemorate what Jesus did. So guess what they grabbed? The two elements. They grabbed the wine, they grabbed the unleavened bread, they put them together, and they would consume them while they were praising the Lord and honoring what Jesus had done for all of them. By lifting those two things from the Passover Seder, they could commemorate Jesus not just once a year. Whenever you do this, began to take on a bigger understanding. Anytime, the first Sunday of the month, Saturday, in a hospital visitation, whenever you do the blood of the wine and the bread, the broken bread, is a symbol of Jesus. And that's why we have communion.
That's so beautiful, Dr. J. I love it. It is a celebration, of course, and I have often wondered why we as Christians don't take the whole service on many of the communion Sundays and do a Seder and explain all of this, because usually, communion is done in kind of a hurry. It's either done before the service or before the sermon or after, but it's all kind of, okay, we're going to get the bread and the wine and we say a prayer, maybe a couple of words, and that's it. But it's got more meaning than that, and we should pay attention to that meaning in an elongated service. What do you think?
I think you're absolutely right, but practically it doesn't work during a Sunday service because a Passover service can go anywhere between an hour to 4 hours, depending on if you do all the prayers and you do all the singing. I mean, it's a huge celebration amongst the Jewish and the Messianic Jewish community. In my house, I see people start to, at times nod off or they get really hungry. So we do it sufficiently in about an hour and a half, but we don't have that on a Sunday. So this is my suggestion. Pastors, learn and do the Passover, and then preach on the themes of Passover. All of those object lessons, the bitter herbs, the sweet sauce called haroset, the unleavened bread, the wine, all of these things, the washing of the hands, the parsley that you eat to open up the meal. Teach on that during the service because that fits in a sermon. Okay, from that point, have a Passover Seder in your congregation and do the hour and a half to 2 hour celebration with a meal in the middle of it. Or skip the meal and just do the Passover celebration, have a little tiny dessert between the two halves of it, because the second half is where it says, after supper, he took the cup. So at least you're carrying over the chronological aspect of it. Now, once the congregation has all of this stuff in their heads, then when you serve communion, serve grape juice or wine and unleavened bread. Not wafers, because they don't really capture the unleavened bread feel and taste, and not yeast bread, because you're violating the idea of a sinless offering. So get the matzah, they call it in the grocery store, get your grape juice or wine, and then celebrate it. Do it throughout the year. Remind people what they're doing, remind them of the link to Passover, and then when spring comes around, have your party. Have a great time. You know what I'm saying?
I love that New York accent there, Dr. J. I keep thinking that, hey, there was no dessert during the Last Supper. What are you talking about?
Aha, this is where you're wrong.
Whoa.
Because according to the rabbis, the afikomen is supposed to be the last thing that you eat at the meal. So in a sense, it is a type of dessert. Oh, now think of this wonderful thought. Isn't Jesus the dessert of our existence? That through him, he is the item that follows up and completes the meal that we call our lives. And we enjoy him, we focus on him. And when we stand in the Father's presence, we will be worshiping the Lamb that has been slain, according to the book of Revelation, who is now alive. And we will be worshiping him. He will be our primary focus. And as somebody once said, nobody remembers the meal, but everybody remembers the dessert. What you brought up was a very, very good idea.
Well, I had never thought of it that way, Dr. J. I always think of, something like baklava or, some sort of cheesecake. Yeah.
And that's what we do during the meals. We'll have a full meal, and we may have baklava or cheesecake or something during. Has to be unleavened because Passover starts the week of unleavened bread. So there can't be any yeast products in the meal. No hot cross buns, nothing like that, okay?
Well, real quick, why unleavened? Just briefly touch on that. I think that's an important point, that it has to be unleavened. What's the symbolic part of that?
Again, remember that the Feast of Unleavened Bread was part of the original commands and goes all the way back to the Exodus. And of course, the rabbis, the sages over the years in the Jewish community asked the question, well, why? Why unleavened bread? Well, they've come up with a lot of answer. It's indicative, or it represents sin. Because just as you put a little bit of yeast in a lump of dough, so yeast begins to grow and it inflates the dough with gases. And so just like sin gets in and gives us pride, pride puffs us up. And when we eat unleavened bread, it reminds us we need to ditch all sin and all pride and just be that humble, lowly loaf of bread before the Lord. And actually, Paul talks about the same thing. He's talking about let us eat of the unleavened bread. Well, he didn't invent that. He's simply saying the same things that the rabbis of his day were already teaching. He's teaching it now in the context of a first century Jewish Christian, actually, if you want to say a Messianic Jewish congregation in Jerusalem. And as the congregation grew and spread out through the Middle East, all of this was taken with it. However, as I said before, as they started to move away from their Jewish roots, Passover was gradually pushed out as, oh, that's a Jewish thing. And we don't do the Jewish thing anymore as Gentiles. But Jesus told us to do the wine and the bread. So we'll do this. And that brings us full circle to the beginning of this show. They're actually celebrating a Jewish feast that they are denying in one direction, and yet the core components of it is what they're using to celebrate communion. I think it's going to be an eye-opening experience when a Jewish Messiah comes back and we see him wearing, the tzitzit on his garments according to the Torah, and Jesus is going to be Torah observant because it's his law and he'll be following it. So when Jesus comes back, the Jews will go, oh, we know you, because you're like us. And the rest of the Gentile world are going to say, wow, did we miss that?
Well, John says that the Word became flesh. Well, at that point, when he became flesh, he became Torah. Because there was no New Testament. There was no Gospels written. There was no epistles written. So, the Word became Torah. He was walking Torah among the first century Jews. This past Sunday, my pastor spoke on Sabbath. It was really good. It was a sermon in a series called Hurried. We're so hurried that we miss a lot of things. Well, one thing he said in the sermon, I wrote to him later and I corrected him. He said, well, I'm not Jewish, so I don't have to, do Sabbath. And I said, Pastor, you really are Jewish in Jesus. And so, yeah, you should do Sabbath. And he did. He did go on and had the correct teaching on Sabbath, but I thought that just that thought, well, I'm not Jewish. Well, yes, we are in Jesus.
And that really is a very fundamental point because, again, the whole idea of Christianity started out of a messianic stream of Judaism, Jews who believed that Jesus was the Messiah. And then as it began to grow, more and more Gentiles were drawn into it and converted into this stream of Judaism. And so for quite a while, it was still Jewish. And again, this idea of, number one, anti-Semitism, and number two, this idea of supersessionism, Christianity superseding the Jewish people, took hold within the church. And sad to say, it's been a real black mark on Christianity over the last 2,000 years. But the really fascinating thing is that in our day, we are seeing more non-believing in Jesus Jews considering Jesus as a messianic option. We're seeing more Jews coming to Jesus in our day than they have in the past. We're also seeing on the other side many Gentiles saying, well, why do we do this? And these denominational teachings are good, but they're all fractured. Where's the unity behind it? And all of a sudden they go back and God opens their mind to the first century practices and the understanding of the New Testament. And suddenly their eyes are open and they think, wow, I have missed a lot. And so here's, I guess, if you want to say my, closing comment here is Jesus didn't invent Passover. Instead, he revealed himself and his Father's plan of salvation for all who would come to him through his sacrifice. So really, when you celebrate Passover, you are celebrating one of the most profound acts that our ever-living God has done on this world. And it has eternal consequences.
I love it, Dr. J. I love that 2.0 upgrade in the covenant, and that included everybody, and that's the message of the gospel. Well, Dr. J, we're coming to a conclusion, and if people really liked what they're hearing today, and maybe for some it's the first time they've ever heard some of this information, where can they go to learn more about you, High Beam Ministry, and some of these themes that oftentimes are not preached in the church? Where do they go?
Well, they go to highbeamministry.com. That is high beam, as in car high beams, highbeamministry.com. When you go to the page there, you'll see we have radio shows, we have podcasts, which are our radio shows posted after air. We have all sorts of wonderful teachings on the blog that you can follow, and I kind of have fun freestyling on those. But you can also take classes online. And I'm not doing this to raise a ton of money, but think of this. For $25, you can take a 17-hour course on the feasts of the Lord, where they came from, how they were celebrated in the Old Covenant, how they were celebrated in Jesus' day, and how he fulfilled them, the first spring feast when his first coming, and how we think he'll fulfill those on his second coming. So that would be a great resource if you want to learn more about Passover and communion.
That website, once again, Dr. J?
highbeamministry.com. And by the way, please email me at highbeamministry@gmail.com with the call letters of this radio station so I know you're listening.
You're listening to the Truth Barista Show, where your steamy cup of God's truth is never empty.
Do you want the truth today? Dr. Jay Christensen is the Truth Barista and the founder of High Beam Ministry. Jay is a creative person who wants to use the setting of an imaginary cafe to produce a series of radio and internet programs that confront the issues of our day through the lens of the Bible. The Truth Barista was the avenue that was developed to communicate truth using the Bible as the source of our information. The Truth Barista is a production of High Beam Ministry and can be found online at highbeamministry.com.